oh my God, I cannot breathe. Hello, you're free.
I believe that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is Iboga.
Shamanic practice is to actually go visit yourself at your own death.
Withdraw your permission. Tell it to get the hell out of here.
They use crushed seashells, coca leaves, and saliva.
Then I land back on Earth. Everybody thinks it's just been 3 years, but it's been maybe 3 lifetimes for me.
The Hunting for Healers podcast. You're listening to episode 11. I'm Frank Vogt. As much as we try, we like to be individuals, especially in the United States. But in healing, the most powerful sessions are not necessarily individual. They're group, and they're nets, and they're about interconnectedness. There is no family or healing system I've seen that can be as transformative as family constellation therapy, a healing system pioneered, most accredited to Bert Hellinger, a German psychotherapist, who developed this after spending time in South Africa with the Zulu tribe and understanding how important it was to heal a system of family. But before you get overwhelmed with this, thinking that you have to walk in with 10 of your family members to heal it, it's not direct at all. And you only need yourself. And so I brought in Suzi Tucker, worked with Bert Hellinger, edited some of his texts. She's a writer, a brilliant writer, and she's been leading family constellation circles in New York City for over 20 years. So let's bring in Suzi Tucker. So happy to have her on today to talk about family constellation therapy. I would love if you could, Suzi, and welcome with all my heart, if you could maybe broach this subject and explain what it means to you.
That's a good addition to the question, what it means to me. That's excellent. Thank you. And the reason I say that is because I think that for every facilitator, for everybody who teaches this work, there is a different shade, a different hue, because Bert Hellinger, who was the original curator of the work, I would describe him as the curator in that he took the best from everything he could find, really encouraged people to bring their whole selves forward rather than adhere to a school of thinking, to kind of bring your school of thinking and see if you can expand and open to various collaborations. So for me, constellation work is a very democratic work, meaning one doesn't need a particular language or to believe in a certain God to access it. You could do a constellation on the subway. You can do it in the so-called sacred spaces. You can open up the field of the work anywhere. And it is broadly speaking, it's a systemic view that sees the system, your internal system, as being influenced and informed by the system behind you, sometimes going back many, many, many generations. So we learn to navigate through our predecessors, and sometimes we get ensnared in the old navigation, and constellation work kind of seeks to allow people to bring forward what makes sense to bring forward and to release some of what they have inadvertently brought forward back to the past where it belongs.
I get the sense in talking to you that some people conduct healing. It's a very efferent activity, and they're in the front, and healing is something they produce or guide. And just hearing you talk, you kind of lull me into a state of relaxation. And I get the feeling that things are unwinding, like very fluid and amoeba-like, malleable. And I wonder, is this just part of your inherent nature? Is this something that comes from constellation work? And of course, the answer might be somewhere between the two. But I'm curious as to how doing this constellation work, which we'll get more into, has informed who you are as a space holder and a facilitator.
It's also a good question. I would say that it is, why do I love constellation work? Because it was already a part of me, and I was given a language and even permission to have the way in the world that I have. So that's sort of one side of it. The other side of it is, I think that the view, the perspective, the process, but the perspective first. So for me, the philosophical lens is primary, and the constellation process, which we'll talk a little bit about, as you say, is secondary. One, the philosophy can exist anywhere and can be practiced anywhere, and the process doesn't go very far without the philosophical underpinnings. I see the work as deeply collaborative, and part of the reason is really practical. So if I have to assert my understanding over other people's understandings, or my resources over other people's resources, or my gods over other people's gods, I'm doing kind of work that has to do with drawing people to me. And what I'm really trying to do is meet people where they are. Well, sort of. Maybe meet people in the middle is the way I would say it, so that together we might accomplish something that neither one of us could alone. So it's important that I don't inadvertently exclude either them or parts of myself to do that. So the collaborative piece is probably sort of central to the way I express and communicate, right? So when I have judgments, which I do, right, I release them to collaboration so that I can learn something I didn't know before.
Do you feel like it's important to know who Bert Hellinger was to understand family constellation therapy?
Not to understand it, perhaps, but, part of the work is very much around agreeing to and seeing our forebears. And certainly when I think of this work, he is central to my lineage. And there are times when I want to separate myself from him, either because of things he said that I don't quite, gel with, or because I'm insecure, so I don't want to compete with his spirit. Either one is a sort of downsizing of myself. I am most comfortable with him behind me.
Beautiful. You're a writer, and you worked with him on some texts. Is that on some books?
So I tell the little story. 1998, I think it was, I co-founded a publishing company with a man named Jeffrey Zeig, a wonderful therapist in his own right, a wonderful international teacher, extraordinary person. And we were at first afraid that we were so little, nobody would come to us, despite the fact that he had a huge following. And I had been in publishing many years. And what quickly happened is everybody came to us, because in professional publishing, you don't make any money anyway. So you follow the people you love and respect. And we did well in that area. And a manuscript came across my desk that it was just a transcript, actually, of a constellation. And I said, what on earth is this? We don't want this. Don't be ridiculous. And I kind of passed it off to Jeff. And Jeff, who never strong-armed me editorially, said, first of all, my mentor, my teacher, Milton H. Erickson, has a little bit of this kind of reputation as well, somebody who was stretching boundaries, somebody who got people very excited and other people very angry. Could you take another look? And so I did, and worked on Love's Hidden Symmetry, which was the first core book in English, for about a year. And I kind of thought, okay, I got this. I understand it. I get it. It's great. And then I went to a workshop and I met Bert. And I met Hunter Beaumont, with whom he was working at the time, and Harold Honan, whom he was also working with at the time. And I realized, oh, okay, I don't really get this. Like, I don't get it. Like, it's not all packaged up and now I know it and can go on to the next thing. And we developed a very important, to me, friendship. And I had the privilege of working with him on about 15 books. I don't speak a word of German. He wrote both in German and in English. He spoke English beautifully. And I once apologized to him for not speaking German. And he said, I'm so glad you don't speak German, because I'm not looking for that kind of eye. I'm looking for a different kind of lens. And I knew what he meant, because when I read the writing, I could hear it in my own mind. You know, it was sort of, I suppose, editing through channeling, small c. And we both loved words. We both loved literature. I always say, you know, he quoted Rilke as much as he quoted anybody, Lao Tzu or Freud or whomever. He saw the poets as being, in some ways, the great philosophers.
And so he was a Catholic priest. First of all, he was in the war. He was imprisoned at some point. He was forced into the war.
He was very, very young. And the story I hear, and this is all a little murky, so, you know, like many great people, a little bit of mythology begins to happen. So, and I never really asked him a whole lot of personal questions. I once asked him if he was ever afraid, and he said yes. And he said during the war.
Yeah.
I think he was about 15. And he was called upon to fight, and he said he had the great good luck of having a heart condition. And so in a certain way, he was freed from having to make that particular choice. He lost his brother. And then he became a priest. And I think this work of healing, and I don't use the word so much. I loved his definition, which was, for him, healing was bringing together parts that had been separated. So forces come in to your family, to your life, to our nation, and they split everything apart. And they also split us apart. Right? Our families, but also our individual selves, right?
Yeah.
Anger gets amplified, or depression gets hidden, or whatever it is. And so healing as bringing together parts that have been separated so that we can sort of make new choices. That the work goes back to this moment in time where the unfathomable happens, tears apart the country, and nested in that are the families that are torn apart. And this work is really seeking radical healing in the sense of not big hugs, not new gods, not Band-Aids, but this, what if we can go forward whole, or closer to whole, and we can befriend and calm our difficult parts as individuals, as families, and bigger and bigger. So right there in World War II, all of this journeying begins in him. And I think that's what took him to the church first.
And then the church took him to Africa, where he was exposed to a different type of thinking about ancestry and healing. And is that true? And then that informed how he approached his work later on as a therapist.
An alchemy, right? Because there, I would say Catholicism is in there too. I would say for sure sort of this thinking that had not only different ideas about healing and reconciliation, but about life and death, about how important it is to account for everybody and not banish others, not forget others, sort of very deeply.
That seems to be the great crime, right, in these constellation work, is abandonment or separation.
And banishment.
Banishment.
Right? So if you think about in your own life, or I won't speak for you. When I think about my own life, and I think about the people who were banished either before me, like maybe I'm talking about my father, let's say, bad man, so he's pushed out.
Yeah.
Well, who's really the secret North Star on my compass? The person who's banished, right? All the energy constellates or swirls around those absences, right? So now, if that happens generations ago, it creates dynamics that then move through the generations. And by the time it gets to me, I know the anger, or I know the judgment, or I know to hate this kind of person, or I know to be afraid of this kind of person, but I've forgotten the event that told me to do that. I just have the dynamics left, right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. I think it would be so helpful if I'm an audience, if I'm listening to this podcast, I don't understand the structure. Like, how is this happening? How does it actually physically happen? Because then I can see it. I can place myself into it. Could you describe, like, when you run a family circle or a constellation, how does it set up? What is the actual ritual or physicality of it? Because that's the thing I really love about it. It's so embodied. It's so in the flesh that we the healing or the reconciliation comes in a very physical, tangible form.
And so I'll start by saying it comes in a physical, tangible form because it's already there.
Yeah.
Right. So it's already there. We're not creating it. We're revealing it. So that's I think very important.
That's a big pressure off, right?
Yes, definitely. It takes pressure off, and you can't possibly do it wrong.
Right.
You can't possibly do it wrong. So it's not like, you don't pray enough, or you don't read enough self-help books, or you don't do that. There's kind of none of that in it.
Yeah.
Everybody at their own pace in exactly their own way. So what happens in a circle is somebody sits beside the facilitator, sits beside me, and describes something that is a struggle for them. And the first thing that I know is that whatever is being described is the challenge or the struggle, and it can be physical, it can be mental, it can be emotional, it can be professional. It's not the first time for that struggle. I know that there is a lifetime of the same struggle, may look slightly different. So I want to know what part of the language in the family this person's carrying. So based on the question, I'm going to ask them first of all, I'm going to ask them some facts. So I'm going to ask perhaps, what happened to your mom when she was young? And the person may tell me, so to give you something just really clear and clean. So the person tells me that their mother's mother died when mom was 3. Now I know that this mother comes to her children, to this client who's sitting beside me, with a lot of despair, sort of despair that is forever, right? That loss is forever. And somehow what my client is suffering or challenged by may be related to being brought up by a mother who has so much despair. And in fact, my client may be, for instance, tempted, is that the word? Compelled is probably a better word, to carry some of that. So this is not my client's despair. My client is carrying her mother's despair. So I look at this and I think to myself, well, what's possible here? I don't know. I'm just going to populate the constellation a little bit. And I'm going to ask my client to choose somebody to represent her mother, and then to choose somebody to represent her mother's mother. And we put 2 strangers on the floor to represent 2 people in the client's family system. So this sounds a little bit kooky, unless we have this crazy assumption that somehow we are connected to one another, and that on the most basic levels, we know each other's experiences. Because on the most basic levels, in the root system, not in the clouds, but in the root system, we share exactly the same dynamics. A gazillion different stories, but only a limited number of specific dynamics, right? So the second we have, and then people are like, I don't believe it, I don't believe it, I don't believe it. And I say, well, could you step in for mom? And the person has this insane experience of being both themselves, Lucille or whomever, and also moving into a field that's not quite her own. And so suddenly she begins to collapse, for instance. She experiences grief that feels like other, right? So we're working with the mother and her mother, right? So mom begins to collapse, and I look at my client and I say, does that look familiar? And she said, absolutely. And I say, well, what is it that you feel? She might say, I want to run to her and I want to help her. I want to pick her up, right? So I know that my work is going to be with her mom and her mother's mother, and possibly the grandmother as a resource, in order to lift the burden from my client. And this all happens in a way that is, people sort of consider it to look magical or to be magical. And for me, again, it's a collaboration on the deepest level where everybody already knows. And even my client already knows. But until my client experiences the relief of others taking care of her mother, she's not going to give up her job. So we bring in previous generations, and sometimes it takes ancestors to come in when what has happened in the client's life is either so big, like the Holocaust, right? Ripples down through many generations. Slavery ripples down through many generations. There's not just one fix, right? So bringing the ancestors in is a resource without charge in a way. They don't need anything from us, but they are enlivened and healed themselves if we go deeper into our lives, right? So it is this kind of reciprocity, this back and forth between local experience and larger experience, and representatives in the circle experience their own constellations even as they step into other people's. So we are if I have 40 people in a circle, everybody is working all the time on some level, right? I can only do, say, 8 constellations in a day, but I know, in fact, that I have done 40 constellations that day.
Do you just trust that the people who become the representatives, whether through volunteering or you choosing them, that there's I don't want to say a destiny, but how does that come about where you feel like that's the right instrument? Is it always the right instrument?
For me, it is. For other people, I know that it's not. For me, it is. I think that if I start drawing lines and predetermining, like this guy looks good and this guy doesn't look good, that I am actually shutting something down according to my own fears, my own judgments, and my own sort of, I really like to be surprised. I love to be surprised. So there are times when you choose somebody who looks so, I don't know, heady, or they're sitting with their arms across their chest and they look angry or whatever, and they step into that common ground where they're in service to something, and they are just completely present. They're completely present. But even when people aren't, it's funny about the work is that you can have people, this was my early experience. I felt like I was such a self-conscious person that when I was chosen to represent, I was not pleased. I didn't think it was the most wonderful thing in the world. I hated it. I absolutely hated it. Until about maybe the 5th time, where every time I was asked, how are you? I'm like, I'm fine. That was always my answer. What do you feel? Not so much. And each time I stepped into that representation with this full, what I thought was like full Suziness, right? the facilitator would say to the client, and the client would go, yeah, that's my mom. Right. So I don't pre-sort ever.
Yeah. I was so excited to step into circles because I feel like that's happening all the time through me anyway, maybe because of the healing work I do, but like, I feel like it's easy in my office because I'm treating one patient at a time. And so I feel so different every session. And so it's easy to associate the way I feel, like you said, also about me, but also about the experience I'm having with the patient. And so it was like a way to exercise. And in my previous work, more than 20 years ago now, I was an actor. And I wish I knew about constellation work before I began acting, because it's obviously different. But I didn't realize how just by your intention or lack of an intention, how something can come through so clearly in such a nuanced way that's not planned, that's not worked on, just by simply opening up the space and holding space for that. And I thought that, wow, what a different experience. And maybe I'll have again at some point of acting just by allowing something to come through me in such a way rather than trying to perform it.
I love that. And I think that's exactly right. Like when I think of like the trying to perform it, I feel almost like it's like a muscular kind of tightening.
Right.
But the idea of kind of just being at ease with whatever comes forward. And again, that's why I could never pre-sort, because I don't talk about you've seen, I don't say anything. I have no instructions to people really, except what maybe in a constellation, I do refer to representation as being this humble thing of being an antenna, you're kind of between stations, and you're kind of picking up stuff versus something grander, right? And to be an antenna means that in a way, even you have no idea what's important and what's not, right? There are ways in which something will come out of your mouth that the representative's mouth, that may feel like so profound and doesn't land any place because, right, in the field of things, it's not terribly profound. But then there are other things that feel just like, oh my gosh, I'm whining or something, that have this extraordinary moment of enlightenment, right? So that is really just kind of finding ease with oneself. So the no instructions, it's not no boundaries. It's just that I really don't want to tell people how to be, because I don't know what paints we're going to use. Right? So there is a way in which, and I think a constellation, it requires and is trying to achieve the same thing, which is alignment, which is ease, which is kind of agreeing to everything up until this point, so that the next can be different, right? But if we don't agree to everything up until this point, we're still going to be looking behind us, trying to fix something back there, right?
What are the orders of love?
So the orders of love, which in a book we called Love Zone Truths, refer to places where, and everybody has their favorite words, energy, life force, love, move simply or move less simply. Meaning that, so I'll give you the most difficult fundamental one. The most difficult fundamental one is that parents give, children take. That's the entire order. And if we stretch that out a little bit, ancestors give, descendants take. Okay, so it's micro and it's macro. So immediately people say, well, my mother didn't give anything, right? It's true. Never erase the truth. Always believe everything that comes out of my client's mouth. Absolutely true. And there's an alongside, what I like to call an alongside, meaning that had she not given life, you wouldn't even get to have the complaint. And that's important because part of our relief is believing that we can lean back into something bigger than ourselves. Not smarter, not prettier, not more skilled, not more, simply bigger. And bigger in the sense that the people behind me are connected to the people behind them, are the saying, I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, right? That saying is right in this work, that if I can lean back into that, then I can bring that to the world and not ask the world to give me what I didn't get, right? So that's the simplest order. Parents give, children take, and what I have to give back to my parents is carrying them further into my life, using my gifts. Using my gifts, that's all I have to return. It's the only thing I can return. And then there are nuances that have to do with, in that order, the older children are closer to source than the younger children and all kinds of things like that. But that kind of hierarchy, which is not a hierarchy of power, it's a hierarchy of peace in a sense. And sometimes it means that I need to have distance from parents, for instance, who were abusive, right? And in this structure, in this order, I can gain distance without feeling guilty or without feeling like somehow I am hurting those who hurt me. I see that they are taken care of by people who are bigger than me. And I let them kind of have their place, but I don't sacrifice myself to it. So the architecture in family constellations is controversial sometimes because I think people understand it in a way, that it's really a kind of radical inclusion because that's what gives me permission to move in the world that I seek to move in the world.
Now, what if I hear that and I could be like, well, if my parents are sick and I take care of them or I support them or live with them, is that me taking care of them? Is that a reversal of the order?
No, I mean, it is if you think it is, but right. So if you take care of them as though they're, the old thing, which getting older, I really resent now, that old people become like little kids or whatever it is. That's a reversal of order. And what it's a recipe for is the child in the caretaking position is going to be one very resentful human being. And the cared for parent, in fact, is not going to be cared for. Maybe they're going to be fed, but they're not going to be cared for, right? So if we maintain the order and take care of those who came before us from the place of the child, we can do it more efficiently, more lightly, and more accurately, meaning if I stay there for 10 hours, is that good for me? No. And in doing that, I'm sacrificing this idea of I go deeper into my life. So what am I going to do? I'm going to stay for a beautiful 2 hours. I'm going to stay for a beautiful 2 hours. And then I am going to, hire the most extraordinary nurse I can find to take up some of the difficulty, right? So it's not that I'm going to either withdraw from or sacrifice myself to the necessity of care. I'm going to find what seems like a paradoxical answer in which I take care and go deeper into my life.
Some people talk about ancestral trauma in a very biological way in the DNA. Now there's talk of that trauma can be transferred in the DNA. How do you think about the biological aspect of what's happening with ancestry and trauma?
Oh, I think it's 100%. And I will venture to answer for Bert, knowing full well that I have no right to. I think he would love it because it kind of, actually in every way it corroborates the sense that we are carrying things quite literally for other people. And, a part of the sort of whole scientific explosion of the last 10 years also talks about neuroplasticity and, sort of lightly creating new neural pathways and all of that kind of thing. So the imagery that we carry that weds us to the past can be met with imagery that allows for, acknowledges the past. Or one of Hellinger's most, central phrases was acknowledging what is. Do not pretend it didn't happen. Know that it happened. And then begin to develop a practice around orienting toward the future, right? I can't honestly orient to the future unless I acknowledge the past, whether that's in my hands, right? His book, My Grandmother's Hands, I think Resme Manekam's book, that if I carry trauma in my DNA, isn't it good to know it so that I can work with it rather than pretend it doesn't exist and ignore it, because it's going to guide me whether I know it or not, right? So I think he would love it, and I think he would feel that it really corroborates his view and buoys it.
It's so interesting to think about the ancestry, especially as it relates to war or violence. How do you notice, what's the experience of your observation with children and whether or not they're holding something?
Let's see. What would I say about that? First of all, I would say that the allowance that something may be influencing the child that we don't see is a pretty big paradigm shift for most people. Right? We're very much laser focused on kind of, making the child the identified patient somehow and focusing everything on fixing that child. So there is something to me about looking at the ecology, even beyond the current family, that can only be positive. There is no downside to imagining that perhaps this is something that runs through the generation on such a sort of subliminal level that opening ourselves to the awareness of it may free that child. For me, the second you go in and say, I'm going to free that child by doing this, you're in trouble, right? You're in trouble. It's kind of like magical thinking, right? But if we let ourselves explore influences beyond what we see, I think that can only be good. I think that can be only good. And, I think that there are all sorts of things, too, that we, there is constellation bypass, I would say, which works the same way as every other bypass, where we focus on the one answer that we must find in order to be free. And for me, it's 1,000 answers, and just the possibility that one thing is related to the next is magical. It's magical. Mm-hmm. And for me, I'm always looking for, and I think, when you ask the question about the collaborative piece, why is that important to me? Because I would say I came by it through some work, right? And that it's such a relief to me to, listen to learn versus to win, which would be my favorite way of listening. I'm going to listen because I'm smarter than you and I'm good, right? It's such a relief to move into this space where that's not my, defense doesn't go up first, collaboration comes first. So there's a way in which just the questions, just what is influencing, what's the possibility, and can we work the muscles around the wound rather than hammering away at the wound, right? And when we zero in, we become very uncreative and intolerant, right? So if I look at that child and I say, if my first response is, oh, wow, I wonder what has his attention, right? Rather than, holy, what the hell am I going to do, right? Rather than fear-driven.
It's an exploration rather than something to fix. Yeah. I inspired by the work, in combining sort of two arts, because I do a lot of tarot reading with cards, but not as I'm reading the future. I more use it, especially in the realm of constellations, to stand in. So in this case, because I'm working one-on-one, so the cards stand in for father, grandfather, son, friend. And it's amazing how they change shape, and the figures in the cards change meaning in any given reading based on who they are. And so like, I'm just thinking even this weekend, I'm going to see my parents, and I can see how the cards lay out that like my father's way over here and I'm over here. But I don't really know that. Like, it's somehow blind to me until I lay out things, until I see. And I place each person in my family in a card, and then he's over here. And then I realize that I want to see him. I want to go to him. And that somehow brings me strength. It sort of gives me more grounding or rooting. And that shifts other things in my life that didn't seem related to that at all. And it's quite a profound thing that you know, a card or a flat image can hold so much information based on what we project onto it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I don't have them up. They're downstairs. I have a bunch of little figures, and I like footprints. I don't know if in the workshops you were in, I had footprints with me. You know, there is sort of a very, very, very basic thing about constellations that I think it's just cool and accessible to everybody, which is the out picturing what we carry inside. It's an immediate relief to put it out here, to see it rather than to think it and feel it. And rather than rumination and cyclical analysis and all that stuff, it's just out there. And you say to yourself, wow, my father's standing over there. I want to go to him, right? That's something that might take a lifetime to come to internally. But when you just see it, and then you see the possibility of what that journey might be. And then, as you say, the kind of ripple effect, standing in the field that maybe we've avoided, or connecting to the larger. Because when I think of your father, of course, I think of this line of men that goes back, you know, thousands upon thousands. And there is resonance for you back there, whatever your choices are now. I mean, that's something I adore about constellation work too, is that people feel so isolated sometimes in their rebellions within the small space, but we just have to go back, you know, a couple of generations, and there is resonance and permission, and somebody is saying, I wanted to be a poet, or hell, I wanted to be a girl, or I wanted to, whatever, you know, you go deeper. It gives me pleasure that you can do that.
It seems like in the books, in some of the transcriptions of the circles that Bert led, that so much of the surprise would be what would come out of his mouth, only because it seems irregular in the moment, and then 2 moments later, or maybe 50 moments later, it all seems like, of course, like, how did I not see that? Did you often have that type of experience with him, or even in the circles that you run?
Yes, and people talk about the field talking, and that's not my language. It's just not my language. I know what they mean, I think. Maybe I don't know what they mean, actually, come to think of it. For me, it is the collaboration speaking in a certain way. It is like the third word, not the first or the second. And his sentences were like that. And as a facilitator, as a teacher, and when I work one-on-one, the same thing. I feel like my greatest strength, in a way, here is that I am interested and engaged, and I am free. So I can travel around your field. I'm not afraid of your mom or your horrible Uncle Joe. I don't feel the need to take care of your grandfather or your older brother. So in that sense, I have the ability to kind of travel where you don't. You don't. You know, you're born into a position where you know where you can go and what's dangerous and what's not. I get to have this sort of lovely, wise ignorance. I don't know. And, you know, Bert used to talk about this idea of the complained about parent is the parent he went to, his heart went to. And he wasn't talking about, you know, you're saying something mean about your mom, so I love your mom. It wasn't combative. It was that, oh, it's okay. It's okay that you have that. and I am free to stand with her. It's okay that you have all of that anger and, you know, you've earned it in a way. But I, as a facilitator, am free to stand with her and understand something more about the system. If I only stay in the client's interpretation or the client's experience, then we'll never know more. And those sentences came from, to my definition, came from sort of being able to travel around the system, and they were completely logical from that meta position.
Sometimes I find in my own personal life that I have challenges because it's so easy for me to see a multitude of perspectives.
Yeah.
Like if I'm engaging, I have an issue or I want something or someone else wants something from me and there's any sort of conflict, I find it difficult to navigate because I could just as easily understand that person's point of view as my own point of view. And it's hard for me to move from that place because I feel too balanced. Like there's so much, and maybe the idea is that I don't have to move or that something unwinds or something happens. Sometimes I wonder, am I moving from an authentic movement within myself because I can get out of myself and hold space so easily?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's well put too. I can see that when you can kind of hold all the paradoxes in a certain way, if we're not moving away from something, right, and we're not clearly moving towards something, we see all the paradoxes, so it becomes difficult to move. One of the things that I think Bert said this in not so many words, so I'm definitely kind of extrapolating from several places, but that balance in our lives, right? As we look out as individuals, balance in our lives is a movement. And he equated it to walking, that you take a step no matter what, and you trust that the other foot will catch up. And so you get off balance for a second, then you catch yourself and you rebalance. So balance in his sense is a movement, and balance that's not a movement, to stay perfectly balanced like this, is to stay still. So I think that what I ask is the question he once asked me, which is, in any given situation, not who's wrong or right, not whose opinion has more weight, but what for you leads to more. And by more, he meant, you know, in the big and small ways, more life. And that has been a very real, not esoteric, a very real experience for me, a really real practice for me, because I can almost always answer. I can almost always answer. And there are times when I feel myself almost not wanting to answer because I know it means leaving something behind, right? But if I really take the answer seriously, I will do that. I will do that. So it kind of gets you out of the perfect balance into a different kind of balance.
When you grew up, if you were to see yourself now, ahead, so to speak, what do you think your reaction would be?
I would be very, very surprised. I would be very surprised because I think that, you know, when I think about what my navigational tools were, I would say they were around very deep protection. So there is something in the life that I have that is both incredibly comfortable and, again, sort of greatly relieved, because I pretty much am in spaces where I can bring my whole self forward. But it is a kind of risk taking. And to imagine that I could risk either being heard or rejected is something that I don't think I could have imagined ever taking that risk. Well, I use the word because I feel that it's a right word, but I don't actually feel it as a risk, I suppose. I suppose it has become irresistible to me to show up whole, to not be such a good contortionist so that I bend myself to other people's mirrors in a way. I don't think that I could have ever imagined myself feeling so free.
I'm curious to whether or not this freedom that you've found, whether it connects to the constellations that you come from, and whether you connected those freedoms with shifting and therefore also the freedoms of those behind you.
Yes. So, and in kind of two different ways that are accessible to me. And so, in my mother's, it's much more psychological and neurotic, kind of, freeing from some of the very debilitating insecurities and anxieties that ran through my mother's line and the women in general. And in my father's line, whom, I did not grow up with my father, so I've really gotten to know him in adulthood, I would say, in me, right? I connect very much to the Hungarian Jews and very much to hiding and becoming very fast on your feet and seeming to be very secretive and all the stuff that my dad kind of was his accommodation, his way of living. And I do think that I am a deep relief to him and to his people. I do feel the Hungarian Jews, I do. It's funny, I once had a man in one of my classes who was actually Polish, and I said something about my father being Hungarian, and I must have said something else, and he looked at me and he said, now I see the way you dress, the reason for the way you dress. And that was maybe 15 years ago. And I never forgot it because I thought, all right, I have this great love of textile, this great love of, fabric and texture. And I relate that very much to my father and his people.
That's beautiful. And where do you go from here? Where is your, maybe you don't know those steps, but where is your outlook?
To do much more writing. Right now I'm doing a lot of presentations, which I really enjoy. They're set up around themes, which feels very good to me.
And if people are curious about that, they can go to SuziTucker.com. Okay. Are constellation circles happening through the pandemic?
There are online. There are a bunch of, actually I'm doing a bunch of conferences, which I think are great because they allow people to see. I think that one conference that I'm doing next week, I think that there are 60 facilitators involved. So people can kind of, get a sense of various people's work.
This is an in-person or an online?
This is online. This is online. There are some in New York I noticed in person actually recently. I just got a couple of Facebook things. I think that, some people have said that the work grows so slowly in the United States. And I disagree. I think the United States is a huge country, very diverse within it. If you're in Texas, it's like you're in a different country from Maine and all of that. So I think it's growing in a beautiful way, not flavor of the month. It's difficult work in a certain way. In a certain way, it's not for the faint of heart. Because, I would say that the kind of constellation, when we leave a constellation, we leave people sort of at this threshold between relief and responsibility. Like, wow, maybe I have the capacity to take responsibility, meaning ability to respond. And sometimes people turn back because change is difficult. When you change something, you lose something, period. And what you gain is abstract. What you lose is not.
Do you think, certainly in Western culture, how we regard death and how we regard the deaths of our loved ones, do you feel like that is part of the work, that there is that separation or that banishment for those who have passed? Is that a cultural issue?
I think it's a lot of cultural issue, yes. I think birth and death are both such hygienic experiences, and we see death as separate from ourselves, and we build all sorts of philosophies to separate ourselves from the possibility that we too might die. It's not integrated to such an extent that we're surprised. We're surprised when we're told that somebody else died or that we're going to die. How could we be surprised? I mean, it's sort of amusing, right? So I think, in terms of fear-driven behaviors, to separate ourselves from death is one of the major things we spend time doing. Hellinger's, view there, I think, was also really beautiful, and it asked us to hold two things. One was to really live life in such a way that you're making choices for the sake of life and not for the sake of heaven or some great reward, but for the sake of the contribution that you make now. And to treat death with respect. Somebody once asked him, like, well, I don't want to be afraid of death. And Bert said, well, you should be afraid of death because death demands respect. And also in that piece of respect, it will not be denied, right? So there were times when he felt very strongly about all kinds of things, which is too late to bring up because they're sort of controversial, but ways to intervene to stop death. He really invited people to think about it. And he really wasn't saying, don't do this, do this. He was just saying, account for things, account for the profundity of choices we make, and we make them so lightly.
My last question to you is a question I ask every guest, and it's a strong one, but how do you see your own death? Is that something you've thought about? How do you feel about it? And do you have something to say now about the way you want to pass?
I don't too much, I believe I will go into the ground and be eaten by worms. Many people who are close to me have gone before me. I feel that, I don't really interpret it or have a story about it or an ending image about it, but I do feel it. I feel the weight of that, the gravity of that. I think how I feel about death or what I think about is what I think about life. I take life seriously.
Oh, that's seriously beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to read more from you and your work. And I think there's a place for it in this world that I'm sure of. So thank you for coming on, and so much gratitude to you.
No, thank you. It was a really great pleasure, enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzi. More of you soon. Bye now. Special thanks to Barrett Martin for his fantastic music. Subscribe to the podcast, Hunting for Healers. I'm Frank Fote.